Firstly, I want to thank Cavan Library Service for the invitation to present this lecture on Ireland's role in the global upheavals after the Great War. One thing I want to emphasize is that the carnage of the Great War, the Armageddon as it was seen at the time, is crucially important to understanding both the Irish Revolution and the world in which Irish revolutionaries operated. And it's also important to understand that Ireland was only one of a number of parts of Europe where boundaries were being redrawn, where new states were being created, and where empires were collapsing or being broken up. And you can see here that the map of Europe changes fundamentally in the years following the Great War. As does indeed the map of the world, because ironically, Britain and France would emerge from the war with bigger empires than they possessed going in. Britain and France in particular carved up the Middle East. And this meant that Irish revolutionaries were opposing an empire which in many ways seemed to be at the height of its powers, although that picture was complicated by the fact that it was now also very overstretched. But it's important to remember those things, that the world had experienced carnage on a level which it had never seen before, and that following the war, you have redrawings of boundaries across Europe and indeed the world. And both Irish revolutionaries and their adversaries were very aware of this global picture. This is Sir Henry Wilson, who I'll mention again later on, and the newspaper here features British troops being sent into Glasgow during 1919. Now, Wilson was very, very concerned that Britain was overstretched, that the British military could not keep control of what he called its storm centres. And he also believed that in fighting the IRA, the British were actually fighting New York and Cairo and Calcutta and Moscow, who were only using Ireland as a tool against England. And he feared that if Ireland was lost, then the empire and perhaps Britain itself would follow. Now, Wilson's a very significant figure, and I'll return to him in my conclusion. But it's interesting as well that there were Irish revolutionaries who also saw this global picture. Here is Harry Boland with Eamon de Valera in New York. It was Boland who said in 1920, in the autumn of 1920, that left to ourselves in Ireland, we cannot hope to win the final victory. He proposed instead a worldwide organisation whereby we can meet the enemy, not alone in Ireland, but all over the globe. Thus can Britain be shown the power of Ireland. To Australia, Canada, South Africa, India, Egypt and Moscow, our men must go to make common cause against our common foe. So Boland certainly had a global picture in mind, as did many of the other Irish revolutionaries who operated outside of Ireland. And during this period, there is a great affinity between Ireland and India and Egypt in particular. There was a great deal of interaction on the global stage in London, in Berlin, in New York and San Francisco with Indian and Egyptian revolutionaries. Indeed, the man in the middle there, Lala Lajpat Raj, promised the Irish Race Convention in Philadelphia in 1919 that by 1925 there would be far more Sinn Féiners in India than in Ireland. On the left there you have Zaghloul, the leader of the Egyptian nationalists. Lloyd George feared a Sinn Féin mischief-making machine across the Middle East. And you also there have Shapuri Saklatavala, known as SAC, who was an Indian communist, member of the House of Commons from 1922, and a man with a great interest in the Irish question and a conduit for many contacts between Irish revolutionaries and Indian and other revolutionaries in London and elsewhere in those years. And here is New York, 1920. The Indians had a diaspora, as did the Irish. And here you have the Friends of Freedom for India meeting in New York, and their guest speaker is Eamon de Valera. And at this meeting, Eamon de Valera expressed solidarity, not just with India, but with Egypt and with Persia as well. So it's significant to remember that Irish revolutionaries in particular interacted with what one writer called our brothers in pain, the Egyptians and the Indians. And during 1921, the IRA's journal On Tóglacht reflected how the Irish War of Independence is not the only war England is engaged in. She's fighting over half Asia against Arabs, Turks, Persians and Russians, and must provide men, stores and money for those operations. The plain fact is that England now has her hands full and is finding it increasingly hard to maintain her wars. Additional pressure on any one front makes their task more difficult than all the others. We here in Ireland cannot guarantee that the English will be beaten by the Turks or Arabs, but we can guarantee that they will take no troops to Asia because they are safe from us. So again, the IRA and Irish Republicans are very cognizant of England's imperial commitments. But what we should also remember, of course, is that Irish men in the British military were engaged in all these conflicts. The last campaign of the Leinster Regiment, for example, was in putting down the Malabar Rebellion in southern India during 1921. And Connaught Rangers, the Munster Fusiliers, the Royal Irish Rifles and so on, are all engaged in conflicts with the Bolsheviks, with Egyptian and Indian and Iraqi rebels and so on at this time. So the Irish story is, of course, very complex in that regard. But the IRA certainly also sees this as part of a global conflict. The War of Independence, of course, coincided with several new factors in international affairs. One was that self-determination, as promoted by President Woodrow Wilson, was in vogue. You also had the impact of the Bolshevik Revolution and a new consciousness among colonial peoples. And Irish Republicans were among the many people who placed great hopes initially in Woodrow Wilson. And that was reflected indeed in Sinn Féin's election material during 1918. December 1918, most of Sinn Féin's election material stresses that a victory for Sinn Féin in the election means that Ireland will be able to go to the Paris Peace Conference. And people really think that that is a possibility. So again, you see here, Poland free, an object lesson for Ireland. Sinn Féin election leaflet stressing that Poland has become independent. You also see crowds here in Dublin flying the stars and stripes. Indeed, crowds in Cairo in the same period also used the American flag at demonstrations. So you can see the impact that Wilson's promises of self-determination make on Irish people. And there's a real hope that there will be some way of securing independence, perhaps without more conflict as well. So it's significant, I think, that we remember that. But despite the high hopes of Irish Republicans, you also have then these hopes being dashed, because key figures in Wilson's administration, such as Robert Lansing, the Secretary of State, realised what he called the danger of putting such ideas in the minds of certain races. Lansing asserted that Wilson's slogan was bound to be the basis of impossible demands in the Peace Congress and will create trouble in many lands. What effect will it have on the Irish, the Indians, the Egyptians and the nationalists among the Boers? Will it not breed discontent, disorder and rebellion? The phrase is simply loaded with dynamite. It will raise hopes which can never be realised. So this again is realpolitik in many ways. An American politician who realises that the hopes of Irish Republicans for recognition at the peace conference is actually not going to happen. And this sense that actually Wilson has made a mistake in, as Lansing puts it, putting these ideas into the minds of people like the Irish, the Egyptians and the Indians and so on. So ultimately the Irish are far from the only people to be disappointed by the peace conference. And indeed, what you find over the next number of years is that, sorry, there seems to be a problem with this. Excuse me. This is Robert Lansing here. This is an Irish commentary on the refusal of the British to give self-government to the Egyptians. What you then find, of course, as disappointment grows with the promise of Wilsonian self-determination, the Irish begin to look elsewhere for aid. And after 1916, Irish Republicans mobilised Irish people wherever they had established communities. So from Glasgow to Chicago to Buenos Aires, Cape Town and Melbourne. In each place, they find distinct problems and opportunities. So of course, the Irish organise in Britain. There's a very distinctive, large Irish community, but Scotland is different to England in that regard. They organise in Newfoundland, in Quebec, in Canada, in the United States, in Australia, New Zealand, and so on. Many diverse groups are inspired by Ireland's example, but they also meet opposition in each place. For example, outside of the United States, the Irish in the Anglophone world, for example, tend to be working in societies that still owe a great deal of loyalty to Britain. And there they find very distinctive forms of loyalism. So again, you sometimes find people of Irish Protestant descent opposing Irish republicanism in Australia, New Zealand, or in Scotland, or indeed in Liverpool. The ladies here are members of an Orange Lodge in Liverpool, which was one of the most vibrant centres of Orangism in Britain. And this is part of the story too of the Irish diaspora. And you also see here Australian loyalists protesting in Victoria against, and in Melbourne against Sinn Féin during 1921. But Ireland inspires others, perhaps surprisingly. So this is Marcus Garvey, the great leader of West Indian and African nationalism in this era. Garvey is very influenced by Ireland, sees the Irish struggle as very important. In 1919, American military intelligence reports that what they call all the coloured speakers in Harlem are using the Irish question in their discussions. Cyril Briggs, another radical, a member of the African Black Brotherhood, describes the Irish struggle as the greatest epic of modern history, a struggle that should have the support of every lover of liberty. In August 1920, Marcus Garvey sends greetings from a huge rally at Madison Square Gardens to De Valera and says that Ireland shall be free even as Africa shall be free for the Negroes of the world. Keep up the fight for a free Ireland. Later that month, Garvey's organisation is certainly involved in convincing at least some African-American workers to support a strike on Manhattan's docks in protest at the hunger strike of Terence MacSweeney and the Irish cause more generally. And thousands of dock workers take action, many of them Irish, but also some Italian, African-American, and others at this time, which shows you the reach of the Irish issue at this point. New York, of course, was a hub for all kinds of diasporas and political movements, and there people like Harry Boland, Patrick McCartan became members of the League of Oppressed Peoples, which sought to show solidarity with those in Egypt, India, Korea, Russia, and China, and also with Jewish people in Eastern Europe then facing a renewed wave of anti-Semitism. Indeed, Zionists in the United States also expressed sympathy with the Irish cause. The Irish Race Convention heard Rabbi Joseph Krauskopf assert that never in the history of both the Irish and the Jew has there been a time when they have been nearer the realization of their dreams than now. Ireland will be free and be ruled by the Irish, even as Palestine will be free and ruled by the Jewish people. So there's, again, interaction with all kinds of political movements in the United States. And indeed, in many cases, diverse groups are inspired by the Irish cause. Some Irish Republicans are involved in the election campaigns of Jewish socialists like Maurice Hillquit, candidate for mayor of New York in 1917. And groups like the Irish Progressive League contended that the Irish were for freedom everywhere. Similarly, subscribers to the Dáil bond in the United States, remember over $5 million is raised for the Dáil bond in America. Subscribers to that were not just Irish American. You had a wide range of people, including African Americans, German Americans, Chinese, and Jews, subscribing to the Dáil fund. The enthusiasm generated by De Valera's American tours of the United States was unprecedented, but he was only one of several men and women working in different spheres for the Irish cause there. It was also the tours of the feminist and left-winger Hannah Sheehy Skevington in 1917 and 1918, and those of Muriel and Mary MacSweeney, the widow and sister of Cork's martyred Lord Mayor. The death of Terence MacSweeney on hunger strike had a global impact. It was a phenomenon reported in every corner of the world. Indeed, the Irish diplomat Joseph Connolly suggested that nothing in modern times so completely stirred the whole American imagination as the hunger strike of MacSweeney and his death. And there was a huge, Muriel MacSweeney is the first woman to be granted the freedom of New York City when she visited there in the aftermath of her husband's death. And it was huge. She drew even bigger crowds than De Valera had done. Although the United States was crucial for fundraising, not all Republicans were enthusiastic about it. And indeed, Mary MacSweeney complained that she hated the idea of the bond drive and doubted her effectiveness at it. She understood that Americans liked to be flattered, and as she said herself, she didn't like to flatter them. But quite apart from the $5 million raised for the bond fund, hundreds of thousands of dollars were also raised for the American Committee for Relief in Ireland, which from 1921 was sending food, medicines, clothing, and money to Ireland in order to aid those who were on the receiving end of British violence during those years. And this was a hugely significant campaign as well, because it involved far more than Irish Americans. It involved a broad section of American liberal and left-wing opinion, and also religious groups such as the Quakers. So Ireland was a very central issue in America in this period. It was an issue in which millions of ordinary Americans had an interest and indeed had opinions on. But this was also the era of the first great Red Scare in American politics, of a new era of nativism and hostility to immigrants, which made Irish activism problematic on many levels for many Americans. Some Americans at least agreed with the Wall Street Journal when it complained that Dáil bonds were being sold to Irish domestic servants and others of a like or lower standard of intelligence. For many, De Valera was an alien radical, seeking support for a movement which had supported America's enemies during World War I and was a representative of the people who'd given America the corrupt machine politics of Tammany Hall. So there's also a great deal of anti-Catholic and anti-Irish sentiment at the same moment in which Irish republicanism is enjoying its greatest level of support in Irish America. This is something we should also, in many ways, when we remember De Valera's campaigns, it is remarkable how well he does, given the context of American politics at the time. But there's also a story here of an armed struggle in Ireland waged by the IRA, and the practicalities of waging that war also had a global dimension. The IRA was always very poorly armed. Indeed, at the time of the truce in July 1921, the IRA possessed just over 3,000 rifles, 5,000 handguns, and around 60 machine guns, for a membership on paper of over 100,000 men. The irony was, of course, that contemporary Europe was awash with modern weaponry, but getting these weapons to Ireland was a huge problem. As the IRA's Quartermaster General Sean McMahon explained, the purchase of materials is a simple matter compared with our transport difficulties. And he essentially outlined how even if 100 rifles were bought on the continent, it was a huge and very difficult problem to get them to Ireland. And once you got them to Ireland, all it amounted to was 2 rifles per brigade. There were constant complaints from IRA units that they were not being given enough arms. So in order to rectify this, the IRA had ambitious plans for large consignments of weapons from Italy, the Soviet Union, Germany, and the United States. A huge shipment involving some captured 20,000 Austrian rifles and 500 machine guns was to come from Italy to the Monster IRA in 1921. And this shipment was facilitated by the nationalist adventurer Gabriel D'Annunzio, who'd established a kind of puppet state at Fiume in what's now Yugoslavia during 1920. For a period, this state was a base for revolutionaries of all descriptions, and the IRA had high hopes that they would be able to get weapons there. Plans were made to land these weapons in Munster during 1921. Contacts were made with a wide range of people in Italian society. During 1920, Benito Mussolini, the leader of the Black Shirts, the Italian fascists, was also a supporter of Irish independence and was certainly involved at some level in plotting with Irish Republicans in Italy. But ultimately, these weapons did not arrive, which gave rise to very bad feeling among the IRA in Cork and elsewhere, and all kinds of conspiracy theories then when the truce eventually arrived in the summer of 1921. There were also elaborate plans to bring in the Thompson submachine gun from the United States. During the spring of 1921, Michael Collins, in fact, told Harry Boland that this weapon might be the one to win the war for the IRA. The IRA had purchased over 650 Thompson guns, and while a small number were smuggled to Ireland during the spring of 1921, there was a plan to bring in the majority of the weapons on a ship called the East Side, which was to sail from Hoboken, New Jersey in June 1921. For a variety of reasons, the US authorities found out about this shipment, raided it, and captured the weapons. Now, ultimately, these weapons were returned to Irish Republicans, but I think the capture of the East Side did have an impact on the thinking of the IRA leadership coming up to the truce. And the intelligence war, which we hear so much about in terms of Ireland, was also waged outside this country, in Britain, America, and elsewhere. And certainly British intelligence was able to find out things in America about the IRA and to capture documents and so on, which probably meant they were aware of this shipment and passed on their knowledge to the American authorities. During the Civil War, a Free State operative would note of the United States that while at home our people are much more reticent and guarded in their statements, in America our people are talkative. The British Secret Service made much greater headway against our organisation in America than in Ireland. So in this case, the Thompsons did not reach Ireland except in very small numbers. There was more success for the IRA in Germany. Germany was a giant arms bazaar during 1920 and 1921 because under the terms of the Versailles Treaty, the German military were supposed to decommission. So representatives of the IRA were offered, among other things, field artillery and even submarines. Here on the left, you've Dubliner Bob Briscoe, and on the right, the Derryman Charlie McGuinness, who were the key people really involved in bringing in shipments of weapons from Germany. Now, these shipments arrived in the main during the truce. So these weapons were in fact used either in the Northern Offensive of 1922 or in the Civil War itself. Several shipments of this material were abortive and a lot of money was lost in Germany. And indeed, the IRA were still investigating the circumstances of the loss of millions of marks during the late 1920s. Nevertheless, it was significant. Other IRA leaders like Seamus Robinson, left-wingers like Roddy Connolly and so on, also went to Berlin. And the IRA were active in Berlin and Hamburg and a number of other German cities. Ironically, Briscoe, from a Dublin Jewish background, was often dealing with very right-wing German military men while he was attempting to buy arms. And he also had to deal with the fact that some of those Irish Republicans in the diplomatic service, such as Charles Bewley in Germany, were trying to undermine his efforts because they were personally anti-Semitic and very hostile to Briscoe because of his faith. There were also contacts with the Soviet Union throughout this period. And indeed, there was a great deal of enthusiasm among Irish separatists for the Soviets, especially as Britain moved to crush the Russian Revolution during 1918 and 1919. Thousands of ordinary Irish people saw the Russian Revolution as essentially a good thing, and the term Soviet was adopted for strikes and occupations throughout Ireland. And the illustration here is of Brewery in County Limerick, where mill was taken over during 1921. Patrick McCartan, however, was a key figure for Irish Republicans in their contacts with the Soviet Union. And most of these contacts were made actually in New York. Now, McCartan believed that a treaty with the Soviet Union was a possibility in 1920, which would essentially be that of mutual recognition. The Soviets would be the first state to recognize the Irish Republic. The Irish Republic would recognize the Soviet Union. The Soviets would supply arms, money, and also open up trade agreements with Irish Republicans, at least McCartan hoped. However, McCartan felt that other Republicans like De Valera dragged their heels because they were afraid of the impact of too open a link with the Soviets. British intelligence uncovered documents of correspondence between McCartan and between the Russians, which were then published in the right-wing Morning Post. The British, in fact, produced several documents to claim that the Irish were in league with the communists. And ultimately, when McCartan got to the Soviet Union in 1921, the Soviets had other priorities. So ironically, it was the Irish who ended up giving the Bolsheviks money. In New York, $20,000 were exchanged for some very dodgy Russian jewelry, which was supposed to be the Tsarist crown jewels, but wasn't in fact, which was collateral for this loan which the Irish Republic gave to the Bolsheviks. Some of that money was returned in the 1940s, but rather than the Soviet Union supplying huge amounts of aid to the Irish Republic supplied a small amount of money ultimately to the Russians. But nevertheless, both at a popular level and an organizational level, there was an identification with Bolshevik Russia, even though McCartan himself came back from the Soviet Union quite cynical about what he saw there. So the majority of the IRA's arms actually came into Ireland in very small amounts, brought by hundreds of ordinary men and women who smuggled them either from the United States or from Europe, and often smuggled them through Britain. Networks based at port cities were vital, with people working in Hamburg and Antwerp, Southampton and London, New York, New Orleans, Montreal. But Liverpool was the key city in many ways for the Irish Revolution in terms of communications. Liverpool was where the great liners travelled to the United States. So people like Liam Mellows, Patrick McCartan, Harry Boland, and De Valera himself all travelled via Liverpool to the United States and back to Liverpool again. But there was also an organisation in Liverpool dating back to the Fenian times of Irish activists, many of whom were dock workers or seamen, and they were key to bringing weapons and communications from the United States and from elsewhere to Ireland, and also moving weapons from other cities in Britain to Liverpool and then transporting them on. Much of this was very small scale, 1 or 2 guns being brought in by sailors or by people travelling back and forth, including women as well. You also then had Irish people working in the mining communities of Lancashire in England or Lanarkshire in Scotland, and they were a source of dynamite and explosives which were brought to Ireland. You also had the Irish aided by British radicals, some of whom had no Irish connections themselves. And you also then had interaction, which was kept very quiet at a very subterranean level, between Irish activists and British criminals in London and in other cities as well, because this became a necessity in terms of smuggling and arms supply and so on. So the IRA were armed really by the efforts of hundreds of ordinary activists, some of them not members of Republican organizations themselves. You can't underestimate the importance of maritime workers, of sailors and seamen and so on to the Irish revolutionary effort in those years. Those years also saw a re-emergence at a global level of the so-called Jewish question. Irish people were very aware of renewed pogroms and massacres of Jews in Eastern and Central Europe, and also of a wave of propaganda which connected Jews with the Bolshevik Revolution. And indeed, on the British far right, there was a belief that the Irish simply would not have been capable of doing what they were doing without some external factor aiding them. That was usually believed to be the Bolsheviks, but for many on the right, Bolshevism and the Jews went hand in hand. Even Winston Churchill during 1920, for example, suggested that it was the Jews who were behind the Russian Revolution. And a number of other right-wingers in Britain published material, books such as The Cause of the World Unrest, which essentially argued that the Irish Revolution, along with trouble in India and Egypt and so on, was at base part of a Jewish conspiracy against the British Empire. There was also a suggestion from many in British society and also unionists in Ireland that Eamon de Valera was of Jewish extraction. He was referred to as a Cuban Jew by the British General Macready, but there were a whole layer of people on the British right who again believed that de Valera was not an Irishman, and this became part of pro-treaty discourse during the Civil War, where again aspirations were cast about de Valera's true nationality and so on. But many people would have suggested that de Valera, in the language used at the time, was a Spanish Jew rather than an Irishman. This was used by the enemies of republicanism to try and undermine the cause. Now, de Valera, of course, spent a great deal of time in the United States, and here he is as chief dressing feather of the Chippewa nation during 1919. The racial question was central to American politics. 1919 saw a wave of racial violence across the United States, the so-called Red Summer, race riots, attacks on Black men who just returned from the war, and also an assertiveness on behalf of African Americans, the era of the new Negro, and so on. So this was a question which Irish Republicans could not really avoid on their travels. But interestingly, they did try to avoid it. And in fact, they said very little about it at all. So while de Valera could tell a Native American audience that even though he was white, he was not English, and he identified with their cause, he said nothing at all about the racial question, which was a huge issue in the United States, except to stress, as did Harry Boland and Mary McSweeney and others, that Ireland was a white nation. The last white nation in slavery was a phrase that was used again and again by Irish Republican speakers in the United States. But even when de Valera visited cities like Chicago, which had experienced the worst race riots in that city's history in the summer of 1919, de Valera visits just weeks later, and he does not mention these events at all, which is in many ways a significant silence. This is W.B. Dubois, the most significant African-American intellectual of that era. And like many African-Americans, W.E.B. Du Bois and people like A. Philip Randolph and so on were sympathetic to Irish independence. But interesting interestingly, unlike West Indian radicals, such as Marcus Garvey, who tended to unquestioningly support the Irish cause, regardless of what the Irish thought about him, Dubois made the point that even though he supported Irish independence, he could not ignore the history of racism in the United States and the role in which the Irish had played in that. Indeed, A. Philip Randolph argued that the Irish as a race were the people that Negroes disliked the most. And it's remarkable, in fact, that African American activists did sympathize with the Irish cause, did believe in Irish independence, did publicly support Irish Republican demands, while at the same time saying that they knew deep down that this was not reciprocated, that Irish Republicans were not ultimately going to do very much for them. And in many ways, that's a very generous response in terms of American politics at the time, and quite a significant one. So what I've really tried to get across is that all the great issues of the day, from Europe to America and beyond, were reflected in some ways in Ireland's struggle. And Irish people were certainly aware of them. Most Irish people at the time read a local newspaper, but local newspapers covered global issues. And indeed, the Anglo-Celt, for example, covers the race question in America to quite an in-depth level. Writes about people like W.E.B. Du Bois, for example, writes about waves of lynching in the United States, writes about the assertiveness of the African-American people after the war, and so on. So it's significant in many ways that Irish people were aware of these issues, and Irish Republicans active outside Ireland had to grapple with them. This is Sir Henry Wilson again. In June 1922, he was assassinated near his home in Belgravia after returning from unveiling a monument at Liverpool Street Station in London to the dead of the Great War. Wilson's assassination was a major factor in the unleashing of civil war in Ireland. And his assassins were IRA volunteers Reginald Dunn and Joseph O'Sullivan. Now, by 1922, Wilson was no longer chief of the Imperial Staff. He was now a Unionist MP for North Down and an advisor to the Northern Ireland government, and a man associated by nationalists and Republicans very much with the pogroms then taking place in Belfast and so on. Wilson, however, was an Irish Unionist. He was a native of Longford. The two men who shot him, O'Donnell and O'Sullivan and Dunn, were both Londoners, born and bred. And indeed, both men had served in the British military during the First World War. O'Sullivan had lost a leg at the Battle of Ypres. In their police photographs here, they're using the false names they gave on arrest. The assassination has been the subject of numerous theories. The fact is that the men don't seem to have made any major arrangements for an escape. They were captured and beaten by a crowd. They fired a number of shots and wounded other people, but ultimately they were captured, tried, and then executed for Wilson's killing. However, at their trial, Reginald Dunn told the court that the same principle for which we shed our blood on the battlefield of Europe led us to commit the act which we are charged with. We both joined the British Army voluntarily for the purpose of taking human life, in order that the principles for which this country stood should be upheld and preserved. These principles, we were told, were self-determination and freedom for small nations. So if there's anything that sums up the global nature of the Irish Revolution, it's surely two London Irishmen who'd served in the Great War, shooting down an imperialist, self-declared imperialist, Sir Henry Wilson, who himself is a native of Ireland, but a man who very much saw the struggle against the IRA in global terms. The Anglo-Irish Treaty of December 1921 led to the United Kingdom losing proportionately as much territory as Germany did after Versailles. Very few people in Britain or Ireland think of it like that. Indeed, very few people in Britain think about how the modern United Kingdom was shaped by the Irish Revolution at all. But this was the result of global as well as Irish circumstances, and had international as well as local consequences. Indeed, in Egypt and in India, the treaty was the course of the treaty and the settlement was followed avidly. We should not lose sight of that global dimension to the Irish Revolution as we approach its centenary. Thank you very much.
As Cathaoirleach of Cavan County Council, it gives me great pleasure in commending the 2021 online series of online lectures as part of the Decade of Centenaries commemorations. These online lectures are presented by Cavan Library Service in association with the Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sports and Media, and the Historian in Residence programme. These 6 lectures have been extremely successful, with incredible viewing figures, which is a testament to the talent and expertise of the speakers. On behalf of Cavan County Council, I wish to thank the speakers themselves, the organisers of the talks, and of course the viewers who have tuned in their thousands for these lectures. Go raibh míle maith agaibh go léir.